Japan Station is made possible in part by Patreon support. And I'd like to say thank you to our newest patron, Joanne Pan. Thank you so much, Joanne, for joining. And if you would like to be as incredibly awesome as Joanne, then please head on over to japankyo.com/Patreon to sign up for as little as $1 a month. By the way, if you just want to do a one-time contribution, then you can head on over to our Buy Me a Coffee page, which is ko-fi.com/Japankyo. Links in the show notes. Welcome to Japan Station, a production of japankyo.com. I'm your host, Tony Vega. Happy New Year! It's 2022. Thank you so much for sticking around with the show and hopefully for having subscribed. If you haven't already, you can just look at your phone right now. Just take a quick second. You don't even have to pause the show probably. You can just look at your phone and you just hit that subscribe button. Just boop, just hit that right there and done. You won't have to worry about missing any episodes anymore. They're just going to show up magically in your phone. So please, that really is a huge help. So if you haven't done that already, go ahead and subscribe. But anyway, thank you so much for sticking with the show. I have something I want to say about what I want to do with japankyo.com and the shows and the YouTube channel, Japankyo Docs, if you haven't checked that out already. Short documentaries about interesting people in Japan. New episode out now about a Japanese emu rancher living in rural Tokyo. Japankyo Docs, japankyo.com/YT. Check out the show notes. Anyway, so there's something I want to say about what I want to do with the show and all this stuff in 2022, and I'm going to leave that for the outro portion of the episode. So stick around until after the interview to listen to that. But anyway, let's get into today's episode. So my guest today is Jennifer Yoo. She is a doctoral candidate at the University of Hawaii. Yay. That's where I went to for grad school. So yay. And I still live here in Hawaii. She's also a recipient of the Crown Prince Akihito Scholarship, a very prestigious scholarship. And she's an expert on, well, Japanese theater, but also onryō. So onryō are often translated as vengeful spirits. They're a type of Japanese ghost. And often they are female, but there are also male ghosts. And I came to discover Jennfer through a very interesting presentation that she gave for the University of Hawaii called Monstrous Wives, Murderous Lovers, and Dead Wet Girls. Such an eye-catching, intriguing title, right? And the presentation was really interesting. So I reached out to her and I said, hey, you want to talk about ghosts and your research? And thankfully she said yes, and she came on the show. So today you're going to get to learn about onryō, the differences between female and male onryō, and things like classic depictions of onryō versus modern depictions of onryō, such as Sadako from Ringu, and all these Japanese horror films that have kind of taken her and turned her into a trope. So we're talking about all this stuff, plus super long hair and quote-unquote dead wet girls. So hope you enjoy it. Here's my conversation with Jennifer Yoo.
The next stop is Japan Station. The doors on the right side will open.
I heard that you were a food travel guide in Japan for a while. Can you tell me a little bit about that? I can't help but wonder about that. That sounds like a fun job.
Oh, yeah, sure. Can't remember when exactly. It was maybe 2017 is when I started. Yes, that's right. 2017 through 2019, I was in Japan on my field research for my doctoral dissertation topic, and sort of to make some money and also pass a bit of the time, I ended up working for a company called Arigato Japan, and they are a food tour company that is run by a Filipino woman, but she's lived in Japan for many, many years. And so it was mostly geared towards non-Japanese people working in Japan kind of vibe for it. So it wasn't like a Japanese company. But yeah, all the tours were themed around food. So eating was a big part of it, knowing the culture about food and
Nice.
cooking and cuisine stuff, but also just like the culture philosophy and related elements that came up. So, for example, if tea was involved, we would talk a little bit about tea ceremony as well. I was based in Kyoto for my field research, so I ran a lot of the tours that were in Kyoto. So, the areas such as like Gion, which is a kagai, a geiko maiko district. So we talked about food-wise, we would talk about the cuisine that's local to that area, but we would also talk about the culture around the sites that they were seeing. So it was a sort of a mixture, but the focus was supposed to be on food. Although, to be honest, I think I was more versed in the other cultural stuff like the theater and the geiko maiko dance, kimono, that kind of stuff, more so than maybe the food. But I studied to be able to work at that company. So.
Nice. So that sounds like a fun job. Did you have any particularly favorite foods that you got to try while you were doing that?
So, trying to think. Well, one of my favorite tours was definitely going down to Uji with the green tea culture there.
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time in that area talking about the culture. Uji itself is very well known for being a place closely connected to the tale of Genji. And so literary wise, I was always very interested in that area, but also the tea. We developed a very strong and special relationship with one of the tea shops in that area. And so that was a lot of fun. Even when I went down there for like, for fun, for just casual tourism, they would recognize me and they'd be like, "Oh, Jennifer, come in." And it was really sweet and had that sort of family vibe to it.
Nice.
That was pretty nice. I also love tofu. So Kyoto's famous for tofu ryori.
Definitely.
Their cuisine is so well known for that because their water quality is so good. And so their tofu is naturally really good. So I would say those two were the most enjoyable for me.
Awesome. No, great. No, I love food. So, and I have, I have spent quite a bit of time in that area. So I also noticed when you went to Ritsumeikan, I figured, oh, you must have been doing that job in Kyoto. So,
yeah, definitely. So.
All right, so let's get into kind of the main focus of what we're going to talk about, which is like all this onryō stuff and ghost and all this stuff. But one thing that came up during your presentation that stood out and I thought was pretty interesting, that maybe not directly related, but still pretty interesting, was the tsuno kakushi. Could you tell us what that is and what that translates to?
Sure. Yeah, so part of my presentation, I was discussing kind of a lot of the superstitious views about women that kind of were fostered from a long history of supernatural, superstitious beliefs. You can technically source it all in just even early religious beliefs. The tsunokakushi is a Shinto headdress that became popular in the Edo period, which would be mid to late Edo period, so maybe closer to the 1700s. And what it literally translates to is tsuno as in horn, kakushi as in hide. So hiding the horns of the woman is what essentially it functions as. And it refers to just this kind of inherent belief that women have a innate demonic nature to them. There's a lot of beliefs around the power of women. I mean, since the time of, since almost we could say even before Japan was even Japan in the sense of the Yamato period, there was this belief in the power of women being able to commune with the gods better than men. And so they were referred to and deferred to very much so. So that belief kind of evolved into something that was not entirely positive and kind of a bit on the negative side of, oh, beware, because, women, if you if you anger them, their hatred knows no bounds, that kind of, I mean, to quote Shakespeare, right? Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, that kind of belief is something that you can find in many cultures, and Japan is no exception to that. So.
Right. So do those horns like connect back to like oni, like demons or something like that? Like is there any? Yeah.
Yeah. So the term oni is a little bit complicated. The original character for oni comes from China, and that character actually means spirit or ghost, essentially, kwe. And so originally the oni were actually invisible. They were just invisible entities that were, it was a term used to account for negative supernatural energies in the area or just a supernatural entity that they didn't have a name for, because this was before they really had developed their sort of very, very proliferous yokai culture with all the tanuki and the kitsune and all that kind of stuff. It was way before that. And so it was sort of a catch-all term for a lot of that. And so there was also beliefs in oni coming from humans, being bred from internal feelings. People would talk about like the oni of your heart, kind of in terms of poetry of the time. And eventually, with the effect of Buddhism, it evolved into an actual horned being. And so we can definitely see those connections. And if you look at the No theater, which has a very close connection to that period of time, especially the effects of Buddhism and such, the masks that have horns on them are largely connected to women. And so there is that sort of, it's not officially, like, I can't make an official statement, but it is something you can observe, that the male characters that turn into like demons or monsters, they don't, in the No theater that comes from this time period, their masks don't really have horns on them. Assuming that they were a human character to begin with. Whereas there's a lot of women masks, there's several, in fact, that are women explicit masks that, are meant to denote a woman on the verge of becoming a demon, or a woman who has given herself entirely to becoming a demon. And so that sort of origins of humanity being conveyed in the mask at the same time as showing this almost oni-like side to them being expressed through horns is something that we could maybe connect later to this Shinto custom that developed in the Edo period of this horn-hiding headdress.
Right,
I mean, it's pretty different if we consider a lot of Western traditions of weddings. You know, a lot of those items or articles of those customs have to do with protecting the bride in a lot of cases. But in the case of the tsunokakushi, it's meant to protect the man from the woman. And so it's pretty different in that sense.
A while ago, I did some research into Ushino Koku Mairi, like the curse of the hour of the ox. I guess you could literally translate it as that.
Sure.
But there's the whole thing with the kimon, right? Like, which is the kanji for demon as well, and the gate, and the kind of spirits come through that, and the time, the old way of telling the time, and the hour of the ox with the demon. Like, all that seems to be like basically what you're describing. That's all interconnected, right?
It's all interconnected. In fact, that direction, the Kimon direction, is the northeast direction, which is in between the Ushi, the ox, and the Tora, and the tiger. So it was also called Ushitora, right? Which is, some people have theorized that that's why Oni developed into horned tiger skin wearing apparitions.
Ah, right. Yeah.
So definitely, it's all connected into that. I mean, if you look at Ushino Koku Mairi, part of the ritual involves wearing a headdress of, candles and everything that was almost to evoke horns in a way, is one way you could even read into it, in that sense. So.
Yeah. And the story that many say is the origin of the whole ritual, it involves, it's a woman. I can't remember her exact name, but I think that is also very much connected to this whole like onryō thing that you were going to talk more about, right? Like, I think that's a central story.
It's a key story. Technically speaking, the whole belief in onryō comes even before that. the belief in spirits holding some kind of power have been a part of Japanese superstitious religious belief since or 8th century, maybe even before that. Onryo specifically, on as in like a grudge or resentment, and ryo as in spirit. The belief in onryo is effectively this acceptance that people who essentially harbor resentments feel that, that they've been wronged in some way, that they can come back as onryo, with the intent to take vengeance. So sometimes it's translated as a vengeful spirit in some cases. Some people have translated it as like angry or wrathful spirit, because the character in onryo can also be read as rage. And so it's a little unclear, but the acceptance of the existence of onryo predates most records of the whole Ushino Koku Mairi. However, one thing that's interesting about the whole practice of onryo worship or belief, I guess you could say, is that it was largely public. So at the time of the 8th, 9th century, when we see most records develop, where we actually see the word onryo being used and things like that, it was largely in connection to a practice that involved pacifying spirits. So there would be an authority, a religious authority of some kind, who would recognize as like, these disasters are happening because of so-and-so who is an onryo, and be recognized as an onryo. And they would perform rituals as part of this sort of faith that was developing, to pacify that spirit and convert that onryo into a benevolent spirit. But not all quote-unquote vengeful or angry spirits were recognized, because it was largely a public affair. And so naturally, figures such as some wife who has resentment about her husband abandoning her, or maybe a lover who is very jealous, that those are not the people who are going to get that kind of attention. It's going to be the people like an emperor or a samurai or some noble figure, as in court figure. And so there is a slight disconnect. So yes, the Ushino Koku Mairi and the story that is connected to it, which comes from the tale of the Heike, and she's actually not named in it. So a lot of the women figures don't have names. And sometimes if they do have names, they're more nicknames than real names, because a lot of them are maybe fictional, or a lot of them are just stories or rumors, whereas a lot more of the male onryo are more connected to a actual historical figure. Like as, for example, Sugawara no Michizane, was a real court noble. He served in the court. He held very high positions, and he was highly trusted by the emperor of his time. But then when a changeover of power happened, his rivals kind of took advantage, and they set him up for basically all these different crimes. They put him up and slandered his reputation, and he ended up exiled. And he died in exile, but supposedly he swore vengeance on all of his rivals, as well as the emperor who didn't support him when the changeover happened. And the year he died, all of these calamitous incidents occurred in the capital city of Kyoto. Lightning hit the capital city, the imperial palace itself. People related to the rivals started falling sick and dying. Members of the imperial family even got sick and died. And so they all believed that it was Sugawara no Michizane's work. And so to pacify his spirit, they restored all of his titles, and just to be safe, they named him a god. So they actually deified him. So he's actually Tenjin now. He's the Shinto god of learning, because he was a highly literate man when he was alive. And so people now pray to him for good grades. And that's what his focus is. But that kind of attention is not paid to the female versions nearly as much, because a lot of times they're not recognized as historical figures, or because of the nature of maybe their motivations for becoming vengeful spirits or onryō. So there's a very interesting sort of disconnect or almost double standard if we were looking at male versus female, which is a big focus of my research for my dissertation.
So I do want to ask you a little bit more about that, but just to kind of clarify for people listening, so you could you consider an onryō I mean, to use the English word, I guess it would be a type of ghost, but then in Japanese, you also have the word Yūrei. So how does that come about?
Right. So Yūrei is effectively a catch-all term for ghosts.
Okay.
So the you in Yūrei basically means like a shaking, like it goes floating around, and rei as in spirit. So it's a floating spirit, is what a Yūrei effectively is. So Yūrei would be the word that we would use for ghosts.
Gotcha.
And then different types of spirits exist. And onryō would be under that sort of division. However, the term Yūrei comes much later in terms of historically speaking. So onryō actually predates the term Yūrei. And so it's a little tricky, but nowadays, yeah, we would use the term Yūrei maybe to talk about ghosts in general in Japanese. And then we would use terms like onryō to talk about specific types of ghosts. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No,
so,
definitely.
all right. So, okay. So back to the male-female thing. So it seems, I mean, well, in the presentation, you say it too, but I always got this impression because I think anybody that reads these stories or hears about these things generally would probably notice pretty quickly that there tends to be a whole lot more mention and or stories of female onryō than male onryō. And also it seems that like what you just described, the type of, I guess you would say, grudges that they hold tend to be very different. I mean, the women seem to be some sort of jilted lover, whereas the guys seem to be, right, some kind of person that was in power or something like that, right? Definitely.
Although it's a little trickier now to say with like the effects of pop culture, secular entertainment and everything. But definitely when onryō were an active belief, more focus was definitely paid on the male onryō because they were not just, it wasn't just a level of, oh, that's more of a respectable reason to have a grudge. It was also that they were a matter of public concern. Because those kinds of male onryō, like in the case of the Sugawara no Michizane story, yes, he's threatening, at least people believe he's threatening rivals, but he's also terrorizing the city. And so he becomes a matter of public concern to deal with. And so that is a big part of how a lot of that practice kind of developed. But then as kind of active belief, religious belief in things such as onryō started to fade, spirits or ghosts like the onryō started to turn into something more of a secular entertainment. And we see more interest or more popularity increase in stories featuring women. And so basically by like the medieval Japanese period, which would be around, people say like around the Muromachi or Kamakura periods. So that would be around 1300s time frame, roughly speaking. We do notice that there is a change. There's a Japanese folklore scholar who estimates that, his name is Ematsutomu, and he estimates that there was an increase by 2.5 times, an increase in a interest in stories featuring female spirits. Most of them were onryō, not all of them were necessarily onryō, in those cases, and that has led to an overall popularity of women being the focus, women being the supernatural threat, which is what we can now see in, say, Japanese horror films. Nowadays, if we think of J-horror films, probably the first films that come to mind are things like The Ring or The Grudge, and they all feature female ghosts. And, or even just this idea of Japanese horror, even if you don't have a movie in mind, you think of some woman with long black hair in front of her face, just standing there being really creepy. And so it has definitely evolved over time, but it didn't start that way initially. There was definitely more of a slight balance to it. But there was maybe more of a public attention paid to the male by nature of the kinds of threats that they posed, as well as maybe a little bit of more respect for those who were maybe becoming vengeful ghosts because their honor was, some disgrace to their honor, or something more involving their reputation versus just being emotional, for lack of a better word.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, part of the presentation dealt with this looking at the classic Onryo versus like the modern Onryo that we see in J-horror movies. So I did want to ask you about that. So is it, because I can't think of, I mean, not that I'm a particularly avid horror fan, but I mean, I'm aware of movies. It really seems like it was Ringu that kickstarted this whole like modern age of that trope, kind of inspired by the old Onryo, and it's been going on ever since. Is that fair to say?
So my terms of classic and new, these are things that I'm using to refer to a distinction. What I'm essentially positing in my research is that there is a more classic depiction, which we find in things like the No theater and the Kabuki theater. And for a time, films kind of tried to model their stories off of that, because a lot of early films were inspired off of, say, Kabuki plays.
Right.
And so they were very directly, closely connected with that. And so naturally, those stories would end up being on the silver screen, and those kind of types of character portrayals would be the norm. But eventually things started to change a little bit with exposure to international cinemas, as well as just a change in the fabric of society of the time in terms of what was how social values kind of shifted a little bit. And so my argument is that basically by the time of the mid to late 90s, when namely Ringu, Nakata Hideyo's Ringu came out, is a new type of onryo for the feminine anyways, that has some connections still to the classic, but is still overall intrinsically different in a lot of ways, because a lot of the focus of characterization has changed, how the narrative plays out has changed, even also the sort of motivations behind elements of visual portrayal have also changed. And so that's why I make a distinction between classic and new in my research, and in my presentation. That's why I was making those distinctions.
Okay. So what are some of the, like, how can I put it? Is it more similar than different, more different than similar? What can you tell us a little bit about that?
So one major element, which we've already kind of talked a little bit about, has a lot to do with motivation. So a lot of the classic female onryo, for example, you kind of knew why they were onryo. They were jealous of a man. They got abandoned somehow, or they had a very clear motive. Maybe you didn't sympathize with it necessarily, but you knew what their motive was. And a lot of their motives had one of my arguments anyway, had a lot to do with social views of women. So a lot of them were defined by the position of being a lover, or being a wife, or being a mother in those cases. And so it kind of had this effect of they're behaving in ways that, they became this happened to them because they were not doing what was supposed to be socially accepted. It's like, this happened to this person because they were too jealous, and that's not good behavior.
Right.
Or this happened because they didn't abide by the social norms of the time. It's like, all he did was divorce you. There's nothing wrong with divorce at this time, but you're taking this extra personally. And so a lot of the stories seem to imply that. Whereas in the case of the new female onryō, very, very few cases do you have that same level of association. And in a lot of cases, you don't even have a motive. Like in the case of Ringu's been out long enough that I feel like that's okay to be a spoiler.
I think it's okay.
Yeah. But like Sadako in Ringu, you have no idea why she is the way she is.
Right.
She's just some creepy psychic girl who everyone is afraid of, and ultimately she gets killed by being thrown down a well. The movie anyways. The book is slightly different, but in the movie, this is what happens. And then she's just cursing people. People that have nothing to do with her original cause of death either. It's not like she goes after the people who killed her. There was just one man who killed her, and he's still alive in the second movie, as is revealed. So she doesn't even go after that personal connection, and so there's a disconnect that is different from maybe the disconnect that happens in the classic, because maybe you understand, but maybe you don't sympathize, or maybe you do sympathize, depending on who you are. But with a new, you almost can't sympathize because you're not given an opportunity to understand. Because on top of the fact that maybe the motive is not made clear, there's this added effect of them being maybe not even recognizable as human or women even. Because Sadako has these unfathomable powers, right? That make her seem less human, even before she actually becomes an onryō in it. And so that is a very distinct difference. And so it's almost like a heightened dehumanization that's happening in the new than is found in the classic, which at least that would be my observation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, something that just struck me as you were describing that is, at least from, let's just say, like the filmmaker point of view, like Sadako is a more effective, scary, monster, creature, whatever, onryō, whatever you want to call her, because the audience can kind of think like, oh my God, maybe Sadako's going to come for me. Whereas the classic one, it's like, well, I didn't do anything to her. And obviously she wants to get vengeance on the husband or whatever. So it's like, yeah, she's scary, but she's not going to come after me. Right. So, yeah.
Right. And so, but then also by that same token, there's no way that you could ever feel sorry for the new. Like, you don't feel sorry for Sadako because she attacks random people. And when you think at the end of the movie, maybe the characters have figured it out and have later at peace. We know because there's like 6 Ringu movies now that she wasn't at peace at the end of the first one. And so even the efforts to try and pacify her spirit, which was a big part of onryō practice back when people actively believed in the existence of these spirits, that doesn't make any difference either. So she's like almost transcended a lot of the human reasons to exist in some cases. And so that is definitely a trend. And I know part of it is probably capitalism, consumerism. You want a sequel and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. That is an element. But it is an interesting thing to note that even if that is the case, the sort of subliminal message that is being like conveyed or is of that implies that, you know, these aren't women or these are not women that we should be sympathizing with. We shouldn't recognize them as women. Which is maybe somewhat concerning. I personally, that's one of the reasons why I kind of pursued this research, is like, how are these characters being conveyed? What impact does that image have on women who watch it? Right?
Yeah.
You know, and how does that also affect future creators of stories? You know, because it's reached a point in the case of, say, a lot of not just Japanese horror, like Japanese horror has become so influential that it's inspired other countries to almost mimic the style.
Yeah.
And so, but they're also mimicking other elements of that style, aka the new female onryō, where they also import that into their films. And so even when you have, say, female horror film creators, they still feel pressure to recreate the same type of narrative, the same type of characters in their films than those who came before them. Because another argument has been, well, a lot of, in the case of horror especially, but a lot of, film and such has been largely prescribed by male perspective and male writing, male directing. But even in that case, even if we have some female directors, there's very, very few in Japan. There's only like 2 off the top of my head that I can think of that have made films that have been remotely recognized. And their first film was something significantly different than things that had come out before. But once they had gained some repute, they fell into the same tropes, the same sort of expectations, and their films kind of became virtually unrecognizable from everybody else's films, which was kind of unfortunate and sad. But it's also a part of, that perception and image that I think is very, very difficult to avoid unless you're consciously aware of it, because maybe you're not even aware in that case.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Sadako type character has just become a thing to itself, right? It's like, it's recognizable around the world. Like, it's weird how, and in a way, it's like such a simplistic like thing. It's not like it's some, I don't know, demon with horns or anything. It's a girl, long hair, and yet
right.
I guess it's become this super striking image. So
yeah.
There's a bunch of other stuff that that you mentioned in the presentation that I could ask you about, but I'll try to keep it not too long. So you mentioned the water, and I thought that was a really interesting thing, and even I think it was in the name of the presentation, the quote unquote dead wet girls. This is an aspect of this whole modern onryō. Could you tell us a little bit about the roles of like water? And you mentioned like still water and flowing water and all this stuff going on with the water.
Sure. So the term dead wet girls is a sort of popularized term that was used first coined by a film scholar named David Kalat. And he used this term to refer to what I refer to as the new female onryō. So it was observed that by others that's like, okay, this type of female ghost is different from the types of ghosts that have shown up in films before this. And so that term was used, and it was first applied to Sadako, actually, when the Ringu film came out. And so that idea of wetness being a big part of it is something that is kind of inherently feminine in a lot of ways. I mean, women are very closely connected to water. I mean, people talk about how the womb is like people are born in water and such like that. And, if you wanted to get a little bit icky, there's also other bodily fluids that are naturally flowing all the time in the woman's body and such. And so not just water, but like wetness. And so the idea of a dead wet girl is a big element, but it does actually have a strong history to it, the idea of associating the feminine with water or just the supernatural with water. And that's something that I was talking about in my presentation is there's this overall connection in Japanese religious belief to water, specifically to bodies of flowing water. I mean, if we look at Shinto, if you go to a shrine, you are supposed to purify yourself with water, but you're not supposed to like take the still water. You're actually supposed to fill your ladle from the water that's pouring out of the spigot to use to purify yourself, and you're supposed to run that on over your hands and everything. And in the case of even just bigger than that, there's this belief in water being used as a way to traverse the living world into the world of the dead. in early Shinto belief, actually, people weren't cremated. Their bodies were actually put out to sea. And so this belief that the sea was how people could connect to the underworld is something that's very closely connected to Shinto, even today. And in Buddhism, there is reference to the Sanzu no Kawa, the River of Three Crossings, this idea that you need to traverse a flowing body of water, be it a real body of water or using actual water or an image, is a very, very closely connected to both of the major religions in Japanese culture. And so the use of water as almost like a fluid, like boundary between the underworld or what have you and the world of the living, or even like a conduit for the supernatural and more like entertainment-based stories, can be sort of understood if you look at how closely connected water has been. But especially this idea that, specifically flowing water, not still water, but flowing water is what is able to carry the spirit to the underworld safely. But if it's still water, then it has nowhere to go. It's not connected to, say, the Sanzu no Kawa, or it's not connected to the ocean to be able to carry whoever dies away. And so there's a lot of, even before things like Ringu, which where Sadako is killed by being thrown down a well, came about. There's a lot of traditional stories where characters were killed in swamps, which are still bodies of water, or things like that, and then they end up stuck there. And so definitely that has sort of carried over to J-horror, where there's a lot of examples of things happening in water, or in the case of Ringu, Sadako being killed in a well is a direct reference to a very traditional story involving a classic female onryō character whose name was Okiku. And she, her story, I don't know how to translate this into English. It's Banshu Sarayashiki, like dish plate.
Yeah.
Dish
Sada
plate
is
house.
dish. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, and in that story, she's in charge of 10 plates, 10 prize imported plates. And a man, a very awful man, takes one of the plates and then, accuses her of having lost it, because that is a crime punishable by death. And she keeps counting the plates and she can't find the 10th one. And she's beside herself because she's going to get in a lot of trouble. And he says, basically, if you'll be my lover, then I'll make this problem go away for you. And she refuses, and he gets really angry and he kills her and throws her down a well. And so that is believed to be a direct inspiration for the use of the well in Ringu, but in general, this idea of a still body of water, like a swamp or a well or a pond even, which actually happens quite a bit in no theater as well, is something that isn't just this one story. There's a lineage or what have you.
Interesting. Just one last area, but of course the hair, right?
Yes.
I think that also does have roots all the way back in kabuki, right?
Yeah, no, it does. It's really interesting to even just look at the term Dead Wet Girls was like very apropos, really, because it's not just someone who's a ghost or dead, who's also wet, but also very distinctly a girl and feminine, and how best to convey something being feminine is to focus on, say, the use of hair. Hair has been a big part of, feminine identity, even before the kabuki theater, during the time of the Heian period, during the time of, say, the Tale of Genji, Heian noblewomen, their hair was as much their identity as anything else, really. And so a lot of importance is placed on hair throughout Japanese history. But in the case of using like effects related to hair, that sort of start to emerge a little bit in no theater, because they have these wild wigs that they use to convey, say, a character that has really kind of given in to madness or such. But in kabuki theater, we see more like hair effects being used, which can be connected in some ways. But overall, there was just this acceptance that, hair was largely feminine, but it also was heavily imbued with sexuality. And so there's a lot of writing that speaks to how perhaps customs that promoted people putting their hair up was almost trying to contain that sexuality in some ways. And that eventually that evolved from people having their hair down or free were considered to be unstable or socially abnormal or some way to eventually evolving into being supernatural. And there's one sort of research scholar that I cite in my research of connections to how it went from socially unacceptable behavior to being reflecting of the supernatural may have a lot to do with how in China there was this belief that the spirit of a person, which was housed in your skull, could travel down the roots of your hair and out of your body if you kept your hair down. And so that was the argument for why hair customs of keeping your hair up was so heavily promoted, and that ended up being absorbed by Japanese culture. And that may be one of the reasons why a lot of the women shamans who sort of communed with spirits or ghosts in general, not just onryō, but ghosts in general, were portrayed or shown or recorded as having their hair down, may have kind of come to be. And then naturally it sort of evolved into the hair itself having some form of power. So we see some kaidan stories where the hair actually develops a life of its own and becomes like snake-like and attacks things and things like that. In traditional stories of the time period of the kabuki theater, the Edo period, and how that may have evolved into, in actual J-horror, characters are shown to use their hair to actually like almost like Medusa style ensnare people and kill people and do things like that. I think there's a whole movie that I mentioned in my presentation. It's called Exte, which is short for hair extensions, where literally the hair kills people in it.
I didn't know about that one.
Yeah, there's this, it's about a girl, so her onryō is one where her body was harvested of all her organs by human traffickers. Jeez, okay. Against her will. And her resentment has resulted in her body not decaying and her hair just growing without end from like every orifice. And so a guy who's at the morgue at the beginning of the movie, he's what do you call it? He's a hair fetishist. And so he steals her body and he harvests the hair and sells them as extensions to salons. Wow. And that hair ends up possessing people and ends up killing lots of people because of the will of the woman entered the hair and just is taking vengeance on everybody. And so we've sort of changed from, the hair gives you an image of femininity in some way to like the hair containing the actual woman itself. It doesn't have to even be attached to the head of the woman, which is definitely a sort of evolution, maybe not into such a pleasant direction, because then you just have this overall like, ew, hair kind of reaction, which could be anybody's hair, but it's still women. Though. So it can be anybody's hair, but still a woman's hair that is being associated with this kind of like creepy, kind of reaction. But yeah, so that's, the term Dead Wet Girls is part of the title of my presentation. It's also the title of my dissertation because it's sort of evolved from being, the onryō, so to speak, has evolved from being a woman who is a lover, a woman who is a wife, a mother, to just being a girl who is dead and wet. It's almost like become almost, for lack of a better word, a trope, or almost like a checklist that needs to be followed, than having the same level of characterization that was maybe found with a classic. But a lot of that speaks to what is the motivation for having that figure continue to be present in these films.
Right.
And so,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Just one tiny thing that you mentioned in the presentation. I think was it Ringu? I don't remember if it was, but there was like a collector's edition or something, like DVD box or with that had like a bunch of hair on it, right?
Yeah. So Ringu has evolved into a massive, kind of ridiculous franchise. But there was a film that was released called Sadako in 3D. So it wasn't it wasn't Ringu anymore.
Yeah.
And so, the special edition box set was released with just hair coming out of the box. And so I had a friend who'd never seen the Ringu movies before, and she's like, "Is Sadako a hair demon? Like, why is there so much hair?" Because she didn't understand it. And that I found particularly interesting because I watched the movie, and if you watch it without any context, you're like, yeah, she kind of looks like a hair demon. Because all the scenes with her are just hair coming out, hair grabbing people, hair like swallowing people up. And so it was really interesting to see how Sadako had kind of evolved from being a psychic being that could, curse you with a videotape to just being a hair monster, which is an interesting evolution in that way. But
I guess they needed the gimmicky 3D thing and make something go at the screen, right? So it's like, I guess we'll use our hair.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I mean, the presentation was fascinating and I really enjoyed it. And I think it's really cool to, have people think about, this thing that, like I said, pretty much everybody's seen, Sadako or something like Sadako, but we rarely think deeply about it. And you brought attention to it in a very interesting way, I thought. So I thank you for coming on the show. I really enjoyed getting to talk a little bit more about it.
Of course. Yeah. It was fun to get to talk and not have it be purely academic and just having a conversation. Definitely.
Yeah. Once again, thank you so much, Jennfer, for making time to talk about your research. If you want to learn even more about Jennifer's research, then make sure to go check out her presentation. It's called Monstrous Wives, Murderous Lovers, and Dead Wet Girls. Link in the show notes. And of course, you can just look it up on YouTube. Full version of the show notes are over at japanstationpodcast.com. And by the way, if you want even more Japanese ghost related content, go check out episode 50 of Japan Station, where I talk to Zack Davisson. He's a translator and an expert on all things Yūrei and Yōkai. And he also tells this really, really fun story about the time when he lived in an apartment that was possibly haunted. So it's a story that I very vividly remember. So I really enjoyed that. Go check that out if you haven't already. Again, episode 50 of Japan Station. So in regards to that thing that I was going to say about what I want to do in 2022, basically, my priority for this year is going to be to grow the audience. So I'm really happy with how many listeners, how many downloads this podcast and Ichimon Japan are getting. But now it's not just me working on this show and the website. Now I'm working with Kyle on the YouTube channel, and YouTube is not cheap. Podcasts, like I can produce this stuff on the cheap, and it doesn't cost that much money. It's still money, and the Patreon support helps immensely to cover the costs. But $80 a month or so, which is what we're at right now, doesn't cover the cost of producing the videos over on YouTube. Because, for example, it may cost $100 to get Kyle out somewhere to do the shoot, right? Because there's some shoots that we want to do that are not in Tokyo. And so he has to take the bullet train and things like that. And it's a whole day shoot, and it's not cheap. So $80 a month doesn't cover that. And we want to do a bunch of stuff. We want to bring you the best content that we can, but that stuff costs money. So I'm not telling you guys, if you can't afford to support me on Patreon, don't worry about it. That's totally fine. I appreciate you simply subscribing and listening to the show. Thank you. That's more than enough. But that's why I need to grow the audience, so that other people that really enjoy the content and can afford to support the shows and the YouTube channel and the website can join the Patreon, right? Because more people, that means that we'll get more patrons and we'll get more people using the Amazon affiliate link, japankyo.com/Amazon. And hopefully, eventually, we can sell some advertising directly to companies and make this something sustainable over the long term. I would love to keep doing the YouTube channel, but there are limits. We have to prioritize. We're adults. We've got priorities and, things that we have to focus on. We can't spend all our money on this stuff if it's not bringing back money for us. So my goal this year is to grow the audience. And how I'm going to do this? Well, I've got some ideas, maybe giveaways, maybe advertising. I don't know. But part of the revenue that we are making from Patreon and Amazon and all this stuff is going to be dedicated to that sort of thing. And I will be ironing out the details in the coming weeks. But hopefully by 2023, we will have grown the audience to the point where YouTube is something actually sustainable. It's not something that is making us lose all our money. And we'll actually be able to keep growing Japankyo from there and bringing you even better content and maybe even more content, because if we're making enough money to perhaps hire somebody else, then maybe I can focus on other aspects of producing this content and all this stuff. So anyway, that's just what I'm hoping to do in 2022. We'll see how things turn out. I don't plan to stop producing this show or Ichimon Japan. I love doing this stuff, so don't worry about that. And again, if you haven't already, subscribe. Go check out the YouTube channel. I really, really do appreciate that. If you have any questions or comments, send them over to mail@japanstationpodcast.com. Of course, follow on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram @Japankyo News. And thank you so much to Unomi for providing the opening and closing song. Oedo Controller, link in the show notes. If you haven't already, go check out the latest episode of Ichimon Japan. That one is all about Super Nintendo World at Universal Studios Japan. So thank you so much for listening, and remember, go find your miniature pony.
Just do it!